Hello, everybody. It's John Marcotte from Heroic Girls, and I am interviewing today one of my good friends, Dr. Janina Scarlet. Dr. Scarlet is a licensed clinical psychologist, an author, and a full-time geek. She's a Ukrainian-born refugee. She survived Chernobyl radiation and persecution. She immigrated to the United States at the age of 12 with her family, and later, inspired by the X-Men, developed superhero therapy to help patients with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Superhero therapy refers to incorporating pop culture examples into evidence-based therapy to help the client become the hero of their own journey. Dr. Scarlet is the recipient of the Eleanor Roosevelt Human Rights Award by the United Nations Association for her work on superhero theory. Her latest book is Dark Agents Book 1, Violet and the Trial of Trauma. It's a graphic novel that gives us a teaspoon of fantasy, action, and adventure to help the medicine of therapy go down. Dr. Scarlet, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, John. It's an honor.
It's a pleasure. So I wanted to start out with a really basic kind of foundational question for your work. Why are superheroes a good avenue to talk about PTSD and other types of therapy?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I think that most of us are not taught how to understand our emotional experiences, right? So a lot of people might be discouraged from identifying or feeling their emotions of depression or anxiety or emotions related to trauma. In fact, sometimes people are shamed for how they're feeling and they're being told, well, just look on the positive side, right? At least it's not as bad as so and so had it. And so I think as a result, a lot of people don't really have an outlet to process what they're going through. But seeing their emotional experience related or played out in a fictional setting, whether it's through, let's say, Batman or Harry Potter or Star Wars, can allow people the vocabulary to understand what they're going through and can allow them to understand how to find ways to cope with their experiences.
So I actually want to let's move to the more specific. Now let's talk about your new book, Dark Agents here. So can you tell me a little bit about this book and what's going on inside it?
Sure. This is the first book of 8. And in this particular book, we meet Violet, who is a 19-year-old witch with post-traumatic stress disorder. In this book, Violet joins the Underworld Intelligence Agency with hopes of becoming a dark agent, who is someone who works for Hades in the underworld and creates a balance between the world of the living and the underworld. And in their training to become a dark agent, the recruits have to learn how to face their own internal monsters. So for Violet, she has to learn how to face her own monster of her PTSD.
Now that you brought up something interesting. They have to face their internal monsters, and that is one of the things I noticed about the book when I was reading through it, was that all of the protagonist characters are actually what we would consider monsters. There's a Wendigo, demons are in it, a Scarlet Witch. So this was obviously intentional. So what were you trying to accomplish by kind of flipping the dynamic and making what are traditionally the bad guys into the good guys?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people assume that people with some kind of a mental health disorder or a physical injury or maybe a disability or handicap are somehow bad. And I'm working here to get rid of these stereotypes and to break the stigma. So I'm actually trying to build this understanding that looks can be deceiving and maybe our old beliefs are not valid, and to show that everyone has a story. And so I'm hoping to build empathy and understanding with the series.
Yeah, we are all about empathy at Hero Girls. Um, there was one thing also that an observation that I made when I was reading through it, knowing you a little bit like I do, and that is that I thought I saw parallels between the protagonist Violet and you. Violet herself is from the Ukraine and she flees fire, and you were in the Ukraine and you fled Chernobyl radiation. Her name is Violet, your last name is Scarlet. It just seemed to me that there were some parallels there, and I just was wondering if that was intentional, and or am I just barking up the wrong tree?
No, I think you're right on point. I think every character has a little bit of me in them. I feel like they're all a part of me in some ways. And so Violet actually was born in a fictional town, Black Past in Ukraine, which in translation from Ukrainian, Black Past means Chernobyl. And so Violet's parents were murdered, and Violet herself was almost burned alive for being a witch. So she and her family were facing persecution for being witches. So it's a metaphor that I was creating to talk about some of the things that my family and I experienced in terms of going through persecution and being prejudiced against. And for Violet, her PTSD is there even 13 years after her traumatic experience. And so I wanted to show that our invisible scars might still be there years after the event, and that if we don't face them early enough, they will come back later at some point.
I don't think I ever knew that Chernobyl meant black past. That it was a translation. It seems more ominous now. I mean, Chernobyl
Yes.
got some ominous tones, but now that I know the translation, I'm like, that didn't make it better. It's not Happy Meadows.
Yeah.
So another kind of thought that struck me as I was reading the book was that it had some similars in structure to one of my favorite television shows, The Good Place. I love The Good Place. And The Good Place, if you haven't seen it, is this wonderful exploration of the ideas of moral philosophy wrapped up in a sitcom. And they really, really explore moral philosophy and moral philosophers in this show and somehow make it hilarious and funny too. And what you're trying to do here, which is deliver some of the ideas of therapy in the narrative of a quasi superhero or action type of hero setting, felt kind of similar. Do you think there are parallels there? Are you doing something like what they're doing over at The Good Place?
Thank you so much for comparing Dark Agents to The Good Place. The Good Place is one of my favorite TV shows of all time, so it's a huge compliment and honor. Yes, very much so. So this genre is what I like to refer to as self-help fiction, in that it's a fictionalized work, but the readers will hopefully pick up some mental health skills along with the characters. And I've actually received some feedback that some of the readers are learning mindfulness skills alongside with Violet and some of the other recruits. And throughout the series, there's going to be 8 books, and each book is from a point of view of a different character, one of the 8 recruits. And so it will be dealing with different types of mental health disorders, including OCD, depression, struggles with self-harm, for example, addiction, and other difficulties.
I was wondering what structuring the work like this does. I mean, you've written multiple other self-help books, and they're a little bit more straightforward, even though they have the flavor of Harry Potter or whatever other fandom you're tackling them on. But they're more of a straightforward self-help book. This has the self-help embedded inside a narrative structure, like The Good Place does. And I was wondering, why do you think that's valuable, or why did you choose to do it in this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that a lot of times people might be a little hesitant about reading self-help books, or might have certain guards against it, right? And on the other hand, if we're reading something that's a work of fiction, we might be more open to learning from the characters. And so I think that sometimes we might be almost like accidentally learning and finding connections with fictional characters. And more than anything, I'm hoping that the series will help people to feel less alone. I want to facilitate this kind of like, oh, hey, me too, I've been there, kind of a feeling in the reader, or perhaps an understanding of, oh, this is what my friend is going through. I understand them better now.
Right. And maybe a little bit of destigmatizing these different mental disorders, because there is a lot of stigma associated with them. I mean, if you have flat feet, no one gives you any trouble about it. But if you have ADHD, like I do, sometimes people look at you a little funny. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And so, who was your intended audience when you sat down and you said, "I'm going to do this narrative structure book"? You must have had someone in mind that you said, "This is the right format for these people." Who do you think should read this, and who do you think, or who do you hope will read it?
Well, the intended audience was teens and adults who are into fantasy, and who might, at one point or another have had these difficulties, and might be interested in learning what PTSD is and how to cope with it, for example, or in subsequent books about anxiety and depression. But my hope, of course, is that people of all ages will read it. I recently received a notification that kids as young as 7 and 8 have been reading these books, some of the advanced copies. And I received a notice from a mom of a 7-year-old who had experienced trauma, that her 7-year-old read the book in one day, was really fascinated by it, and found it very helpful.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in here that parents would find objectionable. It's not like it's full of realistic depictions of violence or sexuality that might trigger people. I think it's probably the same type of thing you would find in an action cartoon on Saturday mornings. It's just there's a lot of these concepts embedded in it that would help people deal with therapy. I really enjoyed it. I read it and I was engaged by the story. I mean, I saw what you were doing. I saw it, but I was propelled along anyways. Much again like The Good Place, all of a sudden we'll have this dissertation on morality. It really worked well for me. So you did a good job.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
My con buddies, I think we've done 3 or 4 panels together.
Yep, at least, yeah.
It might be more than that. So I'm going to ask you the open-ended question that sometimes I wouldn't want to ask somebody else for fear of being judged. But what did I miss? What did I not ask you about that is an important part of this book experience or an important part of how it was developed that we should be talking about?
First of all, I think you're a phenomenal host, and I don't think you missed anything. But if I can just add, as I mentioned, the different books in the series are going to be from a different character's perspective. And my point of doing that is to build empathy, to where, for example, the second book will be from a different character's perspective, but we'll be seeing Violet still. We'll see what she's doing, and by having seen the world through her perspective, we'll now know when she's triggered or overwhelmed, even though we're no longer able to understand what she's thinking and feeling. And so my hope is to show the unfolding of this story through the different characters' eyes and have the reader be able to relate to all the characters that they're reading about.
So it will, as we change points of view, we'll be able to explore things, and we'll already have this backstory, so we get a little empathy from some of the side characters. No, I am clever enough that you mentioned that we're going to be shifting characters' points of view. It's kind of like, I would say, an X-Men First Class thing where they've assembled this team of students who are learning how to be dark agents. And so I don't want to get ahead of the plot, but I think we're going to hop from each one of these entry-level students as they learn how to overcome the things that might be holding them back. And some of them have some real darkness in there. You have the Wendigo character who it is hinted at has done very bad things in the past, that he was kind of consumed by his rage. He's angry all the time. So does that make it any more difficult to have empathy for him?
I would hope that this will be Sunny's redemption story. I think there are a lot of people, myself included, who've done things that we're not proud of. And my message here is that it's never too late. We can always make different choices. And so Sunny chooses to join the Dark Agents because he wants to become a better being. He wants to make a difference in this world. And, just a little spoiler, there are going to be a lot of temptations, and his past is going to come after him, and he's going to have to figure out what kind of choices he wants to make.
I'll be honest, I actually really liked Sunny, and I understood that, but I wanted you to give the answer because that's better. Help your own book. Janina, I really appreciate you doing this interview. It was harder to put together than I would have liked, but I'm so happy that that we did it. And thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming and doing this with us.
Thank you so much for having me, John. It's an honor. Thank you again.